Okay, folks, this is going to be the best video, the worst video. We're going to do it in one take. Voice of the composer here. Welcome back to my video series. It is Sunday afternoon. Hopefully you're all doing well out there. We're going to talk about the Confederate flag, Confederate monument. Should we keep them up, take them down? I know this is a controversial issue, but there's a reason why I'm doing this. And that is because it is something that pertains to us as amateur composers. It's about free expression, freedom of speech. I don't want to see that right taken away. If you look at the history of it, look what happened to Shostakovich in Russia. They were censoring his music. Look what happened to the authors and poets in Cuba. Castro was banning and burning their books. I don't think we want that happening here. If you take down the Confederate flag or topple these monuments because they offend you, who's not to say that someone's going to try to come along and censor the music that I write? I don't want that happening to me. So we need to preserve this freedom of expression, freedom of speech as long as we can. And we as composers, we communicate our ideas through music. That's our job as composers. By the way, you enjoyed the video of this series, please click that like button, subscribe, hit me up on Instagram at #JasonComposes or leave comments below. Now, I've been debating with people online about this topic. Did the South secede in 1861 because of slavery? And I said, well, we could make the argument that the original 13 colonies seceded because of slavery. And they said, you can't make that argument. That's not legitimate. We know that we're fighting for independence. Did you know that in 1776, the British Crown promised to free the slaves if they left their rebel masters? Well, what do you know? What happened in 1860, 1861? The North was promising the Southern slaves that they would free them if they left their rebel masters. Boy, isn't it weird how history repeats itself? Now, I've got some great news to report, and that is that in 2018, the state of Colorado officially abolished slavery. Yes, it seems that they had some of this quote-unquote slave language still on their books, and they tried to pass an amendment in 2016. It didn't go through, so they tried again in 2018, stripped all that language out of there, and they are now officially a free state. So please, a round of applause for Colorado. Way to go, Colorado. Then in 2013, the state of Mississippi, the last holdout of the Confederacy, officially became a free state. It seems that they never sent in their paperwork to the National Archives, which is what you're supposed to do, or what these states were supposed to do once they had adopted the 13th Amendment to their Constitution, or what have you. Well, they never did it. Someone saw the oversight in 2013, sent the paperwork in, and now Mississippi is officially a free state. Way to go, Mississippi. A round of applause for Mississippi. And we do have to have an honorable mention to Kentucky, because Kentucky became a free state in 19. See, I'm getting my dates confused. I told you we're doing this in one take today, folks. Kentucky became a free state in 1976. So, round of applause for Kentucky. Way to go, Kentucky. So, what I would like to know is if you happen to be a former slave who was freed in Kentucky in 1976, or you were a former slave that was freed in 2013 from Mississippi or 2018 from Colorado, can you please let me know in the comment section below if you happen to be the son or daughter of a former slave who was freed in Kentucky in 1976, Mississippi, see, I can't even talk today, folks, Mississippi in 2013, or in Colorado in 2018. Please let me know in the comments below, especially if you were born like before 1999 or just around that time. I'm not kidding you, folks. This is no joke. This actually happened. 1976, Kentucky was officially declared a free state. 2013, Mississippi finally sent their paperwork into the National Archives. And in 2018, Colorado got rid of that slave language in their Constitution. I think we should give a round of applause to all three states. Way to go, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Colorado. I'm having fun, folks. I'm having fun. Like I said, this is going to be the best or worst video out there on YouTube, I guarantee you. So let's get into it. Should we keep the Confederate flag up or take it down? I say keep it up. Absolutely. It is a matter of free speech, free expression. I have been having this issue over the past couple of days where I just cannot talk. I have been trying to work on this video. I've done several versions of it, and none of them have turned out right. I said, well, let's just turn on the camera. If it turns out to be the worst video ever, then fine. If it turns out to be the best video ever, then fine. We'll just roll with it. So I really am having fun, folks. I really am. I think it might be the change in the weather. It's been kind of humid here, and the weather's kind of been cool, but then it's gotten a little warm, kind of late spring. And it rained here last night. Good thunderstorm, too, by the way. So, now where am I going in this video? I don't know. Okay, so yes, we just talked about these states officially becoming free states. But it's funny when you talk to these social justice warriors online about this issue, and they think they're doing something by ripping a flag from a flagpole or toppling a monument or calling you names online. Well, you are doing something. It's called ripping a flag from a flagpole, toppling a monument, or calling people names online. You're not doing anything special. You're not changing the world. It's nothing new. You're not going to change history. I mean, you can't fix what happened 150, 160 years ago, people. You just can't. All you can do is learn from it and move forward. Now, this I absolutely love. I happen to be of Irish and German descent, so I can talk about this. This whole comparison of the Confederate flag to the Nazi flag. Really? I don't remember 6,028,000 Polish citizens being killed under the Confederate flag. Now, that included 3 million Jews that were living in Poland at the time. Never happened under the Confederate flag, happened under the Nazi flag. And just so you know, Hitler also went after about 3 million Slavs, 2.8 million people in Soviet POW camps. He killed between 160,000 to 180,000 German Jews, as well as clergymen, people in the LGBTQ community, even communists. He tortured and killed American and British soldiers, got rid of the handicapped, called them racially defective. Jehovah's Witnesses, killed Jehovah's Witnesses, and even Germans who helped the Jews escape. Not a nice dude, not somebody I'd be inviting over for dinner, that's for sure. Now, our peak slave population in 1860 was 3,953,762. Guess how many people perished under the Hitler regime during World War II? Between 15 to 17 million. Now, I'm not trying to downplay the horrors of slavery, but just given the numbers alone, it seems that far worse was happening in World War II, under Adolf Hitler, than what we may have ever had with slavery in the South. I mean, just on the numbers alone, 15 to 17 million. And the vast majority of those people who were killed were white, especially white Eastern Europeans. Hitler was highly suspicious of the Eastern Europeans. And there's this misconception that Hitler wanted this quote-unquote master race. Actually, that's not what he was looking for. He was looking for an ethnic nationalism, a pure German ethnic nationalism or pure German state. And he didn't want any outside influence, especially from Eastern Europe. Like I said, he was highly suspicious of the Eastern Europeans. Now, if you go back and check the 19th century, there was a huge wave of nationalism that was sweeping over Europe. So each country in Europe at the time was really trying to find its identity. And we as composers know this well with the music of Bedřich Smetana, his symphonic poem cycle, Ma Vlast, My Country, Homage to Bohemia. And you can hear that sense of nationalism in that music. If you never checked this piece out, you got to check it out. Bedřich Smetana's Ma Vlast, great piece. And he wrote that when he was deaf. By the way, that gives me an idea for another video. But yeah, definitely go check that out. Bedřich Smetana's Ma Vlast, My Country, and you will definitely hear that sense of nationalism or that pride in that music. But really what Hitler was after was this pure German state, no outside influence, especially from Eastern Europe. He thought he could find that in the Nordic people, who were actually the Germanic people. And these people had traveled to places like Scandinavia. And he revered the Han Chinese. This is really, really odd. He revered the Han Chinese, and even the Japanese, called them the Aryans of the East, but found the British lower classes to be subhuman. So was it really about a master race? No, I think it was more about a master culture, or a culture that was superior to his European neighbors. So it really wasn't, I think, about race. They look at things differently in Europe than we do here. So it just to me, that I always found that always struck me as odd. Here he's revering the Han Chinese, calls them the Aryans of the East, and they're a different race. They're Asian. Over here, he's calling the British lower classes subhuman. He's calling the handicapped racially defective. So I just don't get it. And he was known to change his views depending on the circumstance and change his strategy. But in no way, shape, or form is the Confederate flag equivalent to the Nazi flag or the Confederacy equivalent to the Third Reich. And I'll tell you another difference between the two is the fact that Hitler was a dictator. He wanted all the power to go to himself, all the power to go to the state. That's what he wanted. He wanted to expand this utopia by invading Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Serbia. At the end of World War II, it was really, really dark times in Germany. Poland, Czechoslovakia, the places I mentioned. I mean, they were bringing in wheelbarrows full of Deutschmarks. They were just worth nothing, just paper. People were starving. They were out of work in Germany. People were homeless. Yeah, it was a pretty bad time. Pretty bad time. But like I said, there really is no comparison between the Confederate and Nazi flag or the Confederacy and the Third Reich. Take it from somebody of Irish and German descent who's telling you this, okay? I've researched this. I know this forward and backward. So let's talk about the CSA Constitution, because if you want to know anything about the Confederacy, what it was all about, read the CSA Constitution. I highly recommend people download a copy of this. Now, I don't have access to a printer, so I had to handwrite out a lot of this, and I'm glad I did. Now, I didn't, of course, write up the whole CSA Constitution, but just some of the main parts that I felt were most important to talk about. But I'm glad I did, because it allowed me to see things that I normally wouldn't see if I just printed something out and skimmed through it. And the best way to describe the CSA Constitution is layers on the page. You look at a passage in the CSA Constitution, you have to reference back to the U.S. Constitution, and then you have to do a little more digging. And then once you do that, everything clicks. It all makes sense of what was going on back then, why they put these clauses, provisions, or what have you in the CSA Constitution. So here's the preamble. And this is word for word. If I can find my notes here. Okay. We, the people of the Confederate States, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character in order to form a permanent federal government, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, invoking the favor and guidance of Almighty God, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the Confederate States of America. Now, anywhere in that statement, did you hear the word slave or slavery? No, it's not in there. I'm reading to you verbatim from the CSA Constitution preamble. Now, if slavery was the number one issue, and that's all they were worried about, was slavery, don't you think it would have been in the preamble? Well, it's not here. Let me double check this. It's not here, folks. It's not here. But what is here is states' rights, each state acting in its sovereign and independent character, and they did want to form a permanent federal government. And in the CSA, the federal government was beholden to the states. The states weren't beholden to the federal government. So the states were independent and sovereign. And guess what? Because of that, if a state in the Confederacy wanted to pass a law to abolish slavery, there's nothing in the CSA Constitution that could stop them from doing so. And if you read the CSA Constitution, a lot of the limits are on Congress, not on the individual states, because once again, these states are they're independent and sovereign. If you're still not convinced, look at Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1. This is their wording. The importation of Negroes of the African race from any foreign country other than the slaveholding states or territories of the United States of America is hereby forbidden, and Congress is required to pass such laws as shall effectively prevent the same. So they banned the importation of slaves from foreign countries, just like in the U.S. Constitution. But they do mention the United States. Now, when this document was put in place, that was in February of 1861, Civil War started on April 12th of that year. So when they seceded, the United States became a separate country. And they were still buying slaves from the United States or the Union. So was the North really as anti-slavery as we once thought? Well, the truth is the North had a vested interest in slavery in the South. You had banks in places such as New York that would invest in those plantations in the South. They would profit from the slave labor, use that to sell financial policies, stocks, bonds. You had Northerners with money who'd come down and buy these plantations in the South, purchase slaves to work on those plantations. You had Southern politicians such as William L. Yancey of Alabama, John Slidell, Louisiana, that were either from the North or born in the North. And it's no accident that in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, Her cruelest character, Simon Legree, is of Northern birth because she knew the role that Northerners played in the slave trade in the United States. So yes, the North had a vested interest in slavery in the South. Now let me read you something. This is the last sentence of a speech. I'm not going to tell you who it's by, but try to guess. Now I wish I may have, come to think of it, I wish I would have printed some of this stuff out. But like I said, I didn't have access to a printer, so I said, well, I'll just go ahead and write it out. But like I said, I'm glad I did because I was able to catch things that I probably wouldn't have caught if I just printed out and just skimmed over it. So here's the last sentence of this speech. There seems to be but one rational solution, and that is, notwithstanding their professions of humanity, they are disinclined to give up the benefits they derive from slave labor. Now, who said that? Alexander Stephens. That's at the end of his cornerstone speech. Who's he talking about here? He's talking about the North. I would encourage people to actually go back and read that speech in full. Yes, we know about the part where he talks about slavery. But what you need to really pay attention to is the tail end of the speech, because at the tail end of the speech, he's actually calling out the North. In this section, he talks about how the United States, or the Union, was for the accession of Texas. Now how they turned and were against the secession of Texas. And he's really calling them out here. So the North did benefit from that slave labor in the South. So definitely go back and read the cornerstone speech and pay attention to what's said at the very end of it, not what's at the middle of it, because that will tell you everything you need to know about what was going on at that time, 1860, 1861. So let's talk about the slaves and the slave owners. Who were they? And I tried looking for different states, and the only thing I could come up with was the Georgia slave laws. But they are pretty telling. So here are the Georgia slave laws from 1755 to 1860. And here's who they have listed as slaves. Their wording: Negroes, Indians, mulattoes, or mestizos. Mestizos is a person who is both Spanish and Native American lineage. And your slave owners could be white, they could be black, they could be mixed, they could possibly be Hispanic, Brazilian, or from the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. And the Seminole tribe in the South was well known for owning slaves. But you just didn't have slaves working on the plantations or what have you. You had indentured servants. What about the indentured servants? We don't usually talk about that. But I've got some stats here for you. Between 1630 to 1775, just before the American Revolution, or around the time of the American Revolution, it said that at least half to 2/3 of the poor white European immigrants who came to this country were indentured. And before 1775, you had 500,000 with 55,000 involuntary, 48% of 450,000 were indentured, 75% were under 25. It usually involved family members. Kidnapping was common. They could not marry without the permission of their master, and female indentured servants were more vulnerable to abuse. They were often associated with vice. Before 1840, 500,000 Europeans went to the Caribbean as indentured servants. And indentured servitude actually lasted longer than slavery, and it ended in the territory of Hawaii in 1900 with the Organic Act. Now, with the indentured servants, a lot of times they would not last past the term because the work was pretty grueling. And a lot of times they had their term of service extended without their knowledge, and they became indentured servants to pay off the debt of their travel. So that's what happened with indentured servitude. So we have a totally different picture now, looking at who the slave owners were, who the slaves were, who our indentured servants were, and don't forget the other immigrants coming into this country at that time. I was researching just the soldiers from the Confederate Army. Looked at some of the Union Army too. But what's really interesting is the Confederate Army was very, very diverse. They had Egyptian soldiers, Syrian soldiers, Hispanic soldiers, Cuban soldiers. There's a story about a woman who posed as a man to get into the Confederate Army. I forget what her name is, but check it out online. It's an interesting story. But you had Cubans, you had people from Egypt, Syria, you had Germans, Irish, Scottish, Asians that were in the Confederate Army. You probably didn't know that. So it was a very diverse army. So was it all over white supremacy and wanting to preserve slavery? Now, we got to talk about this. And that's this whole concept of the North freeing their slaves before the South, and it was all done overnight. Everybody had a big party, popped a bottle of champagne. That's not what happened. I'll give you an example. 1799, state of New York. They abolished slavery this way. They used the gradual emancipation process. So they freed their slaves, but here's how it went. If you were born after July 4th of 1799, you're a child of a slave, you would not be free until at least you reach the age of 25 to 28. I believe it was 28 for females and 25 for men, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's correct. Somebody can correct me on that out there. But that generally was the age, between 25 to 28, depending on male or female. But what happened was in 1817, they passed a law that freed the slaves, but not till 1827. So they had to wait an additional 10 years. So when they first passed this law in 1799, they did not free any slaves, just the children of the slaves. But those children were not freed until they completed their service at between the age of 25 or 28. So this was that gradual emancipation process. And this happened in many, many states. In 1860, according to the census, you did have 16 slaves living in the state of New Jersey. And the city of New Brunswick was well known as a runaway haven for slaves and for slave catchers. So go check out that story. Yeah, a lot of interesting things that I'm learning as I'm researching the stuff that I did not know. You know, and I will admit, I'm guilty of just kind of maybe in a way looking at the textbook version of this, but I'm always kind of intrigued by these conflicts. I like to look beneath the surface. And I did know that, for example, if you check out the story about slavery in the New Mexico territory, that they still had about 400 slaves in Santa Fe in 1867. That's 2 years after the passing of the 13th Amendment. So some of these states were very reluctant to pass the 13th Amendment. What happened was the government sent out federal agents to go to the New Mexico territory, and it turns out that these federal agents had slaves themselves, and one man was saying that there were 400 in Santa Fe alone. So what does that tell you? But let's read some other parts before, or a little bit. See, I can't even talk today, folks. Let's read some other parts of the CSA Constitution. This is one that's been under scrutiny. But like I said, there are layers on the page when you go through this, and this part here is from Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4. Their wording, no bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed. Now, upon first reading this, you would assume, yes, no law could be passed to stop slavery. No. This is just saying no law will be passed to deny you the right to have slaves. You have a legal right to own slaves in the CSA. A bill of attainder is any piece of legislation that is passed that finds a party guilty or a group guilty without a trial. Now, we do have this in the U.S. Constitution. And if you go to the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, I did write this out. It's in Article 1, Clause 3. No bill of attainder ex post facto law shall be passed. See, I'm telling you guys, my word, I've just been struggling to talk over the past couple of days. Let me try this again. Okay, so Article 1, Clause 3. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. That's what I'm trying to say. And this is an area that also has to deal with the importation of slaves or the migration of slaves. And in that section here where it talks about the migration or importation of slaves, which is the very first clause, it says a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. Now, even though they banned a bill of attainder in the U.S. Constitution, and they did here in the CSA Constitution, there was a way to get around that. And that was to attach taxes or duties to some type of legislation. And guess who got stuck with that? Your businessmen, your slave owners back in the day. So that was a way to kind of find parties guilty without a trial, sticking with these duties and these taxes. And that kind of goes along the lines of the Carriage Act of 1794. Go check that out, the Carriage Act. So a lot of these things are connected. But there's other things in the CSA Constitution that have nothing to do with slavery. I'll give you an example here. If we look at, and I love this, if you look at Article 2, Section 1, Clause 1. The executive power shall be vested in the President of the Confederate States of America. He and the Vice President shall hold their offices for the term of 6 years, but the President shall not be re-eligible. Love it. 1 6-year term and you're out as President. Article 1, Section 2, Clause 5. The House of Representatives shall choose their Speaker and other officers, and shall have the sole power of impeachment, except that any judicial or other federal officer resident and acting solely within the limits of any state may be impeached by a vote of 2/3 of both branches of the legislature thereof. If a federal judge acted in the character of the state legislators have the power to impeach that judge. Isn't that awesome? Putting a restraint on those federal judges, limiting the power of the federal government, giving power back to the people in the states in which they live. This is how you run a government. And then if you look at Article 1, Section 8, and I've got to give a quick shout out to a guy named Brian McClanahan. That's B-R-I-O-N, last name McClanahan, like it sounds. He's got a channel here on YouTube. He talks about the CSA Constitution, what was going on in the South, a lot of constitutional issues dealing with the U.S. Constitution. Has a video out there about John C. Calhoun. I know Calhoun is somewhat of a controversial figure, but definitely go check his channel out. And I got to thank him for all the great information because it's really helped me with some of my research. So a shout out to Brian, B-R-I-O-N, McClanahan. Go check his channel out. And also a shout out to a guy named Synergy7. That's Synergy7. He's got some great videos talking about the Confederacy, Abraham Lincoln, the tariff of 1861. So a shout out again to Synergy7's channel as well. Thank you guys again for all the great info. It has really helped me with trying to do this video. So, but if you look at Article 1, and this is what Brian talks about in his video, Article 1, Section 8 is probably the most important part of the CSA Constitution, one of the most important parts, because it gives the power, it lays out the powers of the Congress, and that's to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises for revenue, borrow money on the credit of the Confederate States, and number 3 is really important, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, no appropriation for internal improvement intended to facilitate commerce. Very strict rules about spending. If a state needed to take care of a project, improvement, they had to find the money on their own. None of this government money train or gravy train, no subsidies. The only thing that was allowed, if you're furnishing lights, beacons, buoys, aids to navigation, clearing out obstructions in the waterways, maybe roadways, that sort of thing. And then the post office had to be self-sufficient. And then also they had to find revenue. They had to find their own revenue source, the post office did, and establish their own postal routes. Isn't that cool? Love it, love it. So this is just to show you there are other things in here besides slavery, folks. So definitely go check it out. And one last thing before we go, because there's been a lot of talk about this section here. And this is an Article 4, Section 2, Clause 1, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, and shall have the right of transit and sojourn in any state of this confederacy with their slaves and other property, and the right of property in said slaves shall not be thereby impaired. All this is saying is that regardless of whether you're a slave owner or not, you have the right to travel wherever you want in the confederacy. And we're not going to bother you. We're not going to search your property. We're not going to confiscate your property. This was going on with these people in the Southeast, slave owners especially, that were traveling to northern cities. They'd be barred from entering certain cities. According to the 1860 census, you had 171 black slave owners that were living in the state of South Carolina, for example. So when any of these slave owners went to the north, a lot of times they'd be barred from entering certain cities. Like I said, have their property confiscated, searched, have their slaves' property confiscated or searched. So this prevented that from happening. But it gives free rein for anybody in the Confederacy who's a citizen of the Confederacy to do whatever they want as long as it's within law. And one last thing, because this has been talked about, slavery in new territories and states that were going to become part of the Confederacy. Yes, that was allowed. You can find that in Article 4, Clause 3, or Article 3. I can't even, like I said, my tongue's getting tied today, folks. It's actually in Article 4, Section 3, Clause 3. Where the Confederate States talks about acquiring new territory, setting up new states. Yes, slavery was allowed in those states, but it had to be legally recognized by the governments of those new states or territories. You just couldn't walk in there with your slaves and say, here, I've got slaves, I want to set up shop. And there's a key phrase to look for in here, that's lawfully held. You did have issues with illegal slave trades going on back in the day, and both the United States and the CSA had to deal with that. So right here, and if you look at right here, said, yeah, you can allow slaves in those new territories. But guess what? Those new territories or states, if they chose to become a free state, they could do so. Nothing prevents them from doing so. If you look at Article 6, Clause 1, it says the government established by this Constitution is the successor of the provisional government of the Confederate States of America, and all the laws passed by the latter shall continue in force until the same shall be repealed or modified, da-da-da-da-da. So, because you have the words repealed or modified in here, and because, remember, this is a permanent federal government under the CSA, and the federal government that permanent federal government is beholden to the states, and the states aren't beholden to the government, and they are sovereign and independent, they can choose to pass a law to abolish slavery. Nothing in here that prevents them from doing that. So coming full circle, I think we should keep the Confederate flag up, keep these Confederate monuments up, and I'll go as far as to say keep the Nazi flag up. Not because I support the Third Reich, but because we need to be reminded of what happened in World War II so that it never happens again. I don't want to see what happened in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Serbia, or even in Germany. I don't want to see that the horrors that happened during World War II. I don't want to see that happen again. So let's protect our freedom of speech, and especially us composers. Because who's not to say that if they keep taking down the Confederate flag and toppling these monuments, that we may end up like Shostakovich, where they're censoring our music. Let's do our best to make sure that doesn't happen. You enjoy the video of the series, please click that like button, subscribe, hit me up on Instagram at hashtag JasonComposes, or leave comments below. And before I go, one last shout out to a really cool website called StateLegacyRevival.com. That's StateLegacyRevival.com. Keep in mind, I'm not getting paid to tell you this, but you got to go check this site out. This all came about because I was talking with a guy online who had purchased his West Florida hat from the site. He told me nobody knows what this hat means. And on this hat, it's got the Bonnie blue flag. That's a blue flag with one white star, which is the first root of the Confederate flag, by the way. Well, it goes back to an incident in 1810 in what we now know as Baton Rouge. At that time, that area was invaded and controlled by the Spanish, and you had some American and English settlers that were trying to set up a colony. And all they wanted was their own independent colony. Well, they kept getting attacked by the Spanish. They're under Spanish rule. As for the government's help, but the government refused to help them because the government was in failed negotiations with Spain, didn't want to start a war. So on September 26, 1810, these settlers rebelled, formed the Republic of West Florida, lasted for 76 to 78 days. They took over the barracks of Baton Rouge, raised the Bonnie blue flag, and shortly thereafter said the following. Every time I hear this, I get chills. It's awesome, folks. They said, West Florida, that lovely nation, free from king and tyranny, shall be respected through the world for her true love of liberty. Let me try that again. This is what they actually said. Like I said, this is going to be the best or worst video out there, folks. They said, West Florida, that lovely nation, free from king and tyranny, shall be respected through the world for her true love of liberty. That's what they said. That's what I always want to add the word sweet, and the sweet love of liberty in there for some reason. But that's actually what they said. And I just think it's awesome that they said that, because that just goes to show you they were really fighting for their freedom. So definitely go check this website out, which helps to keep those stories alive and your state and national pride alive. A lot of great merchandise, had license plates, t-shirts, some women trucker hats on there. So shout out to all our women truckers and definitely our women composers. And a shout out to our veterans, because they did have a 5% discount for veterans. So thank you, veterans, for keeping us safe, your service, your sacrifice. And thank you to everybody who's been supporting the series, by the way. So if you enjoyed the video, please, like I said, click that like button, subscribe, hit me up on Instagram at hashtag JasonComposes, or leave comments below. This is Voice of the Composer saying peace out, and I'll catch you next time.